A scream pierces the storm-drenched night. Julian Vance, an architect bound by perfection, storms into his untouchable bedroom to find Clara Reed, a mysterious caretaker, cradling his silent twin daughters, Melody and Harmony, in a forbidden sanctuary of calm. His obsession with control shatters, igniting a clash that could unravel their fragile world. Can a single melody heal what grief has broken? Subscribe now, share where you're listening, maybe a quiet cafe or a bustling city, and join us to discover the secret hidden in Clara's music. What power lies in the notes she plays? The storm roared like a wounded beast, its howls tearing through the night as rain lashed against the stone facade of Julian Vance's mansion. Lightning cracked the sky, illuminating the sharp angles of his world, a world of straight lines, polished marble, and unyielding order. Julian, a renowned architect whose designs were lauded for their precision, gripped the steering wheel of his sleek black sedan, his knuckles white against the leather. The wipers fought a losing battle against the deluge, but his mind was elsewhere, haunted by the ghost of a melody that once filled this house. His wife Elise had been chaos incarnate, a pianist whose fingers danced across keys with reckless abandon. Her death in a car accident 2 years ago had left him with 2 silent daughters in a heart encased in steel. He pulled into the driveway, the iron gates clanging shut behind him. The mansion loomed, its windows dark save for a faint glow from the upper floor. Julian's jaw tightened. That light shouldn't be on, not in his room, the one place he kept sacrosanct, untouched since Elise's death. He stepped out, rain soaking his tailored coat, and strode toward the entrance, his polished shoes clicking against the wet stone. The air smelled of ozone and regret. Inside, the foyer was silent, the chandelier casting cold prisms across the walls. Julian dropped his briefcase, its thud echoing like a gavel. He climbed the grand staircase, each step deliberate, his pulse quickening as the glow from his bedroom grew brighter. The door was ajar. He pushed it open, and the world tilted. There on his bed with its crisp white linens and untouched memories, lay Clara Reed, the new caretaker. Her dark hair fanned across the pillow, her face serene in the lamplight. Curled against her, their small bodies rising and falling with the rhythm of sleep, were his twin daughters, Melody and Harmony. 6 years old, their blonde curls tangled together, they clutched Clara's sweater as if she were a lifeline. The sight was impossible, a violation of every rule Julian had built to shield his fractured family. His daughters, who hadn't spoken a word since their mother's death, who flinched at his touch, slept peacefully in the arms of a stranger. "What the hell are you doing in my bed?" His voice shattered the stillness, sharp as the lightning outside. Clara's eyes snapped open, green and wide with shock, not guilt. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake the girls, her hands raised in a gesture of calm. "Mr. Vance, I can explain." But rage, hot and primal, surged through him. This room was his fortress, the last bastion of control in a life spiraling beyond his grasp. Elise's perfume still lingered in the air, her laughter a ghost in the walls. And now this woman, this outsider, had invaded it. "You have no right," he growled, stepping closer, his shadow looming over the bed. Melody stirred, her small hand tightening on Clara's sleeve, but her eyes remained closed. Harmony's face pressed deeper into Clara's side, a silent plea. "They were scared," Clara said softly, her voice steady despite the tension. "The storm. They wouldn't sleep anywhere else. I stayed to—" "Enough!" Julian's hand moved before his mind could catch up, a sharp crack echoing as his palm met Clara's cheek. The sound hung in the air, louder than the thunder. Clara staggered, her hand flying to her face, but she didn't cry out. Her eyes locked onto his, not with anger, but with a sadness so deep it cut sharper than his blow. The twins whimpered, their small bodies curling tighter, though they didn't wake. "You're fired," Julian said, his voice low and trembling. "Get out of my house, now." Clara stood, her movements deliberate, as if the air itself might shatter. She pressed a hand to her cheek, her gaze never leaving his. "They begged me to stay," she whispered, barely audible over the rain. "They felt safe." She leaned down, brushing a gentle kiss on Melody's forehead, then Harmony's, her touch soft as a lullaby. Without another word, she gathered her shoes and walked past Julian, her silhouette disappearing into the shadowed hallway. The door clicked shut, and the silence was deafening. Julian stood frozen, his hands stinging, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. Shame, perhaps, or the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. He looked at his daughters, their faces smooth in sleep. No trace of the fear that haunted their waking hours. For 2 years, he'd hired nannies, therapists, doctors, 14 in all, each one failing to pierce the wall of their silence. Yet here, in this forbidden space, Clara Reed had done what none could. She'd given them peace. He sank onto the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. The storm raged on, but the room felt hollow, as if Clara had taken its warmth with her. On the nightstand, a single object caught his eye. A folded sheet of music, its edges worn, titled Leo's Lullaby. The notes, simple yet haunting, seemed to hum with a story he didn't yet know. Julian's throat tightened. He'd driven her away, but the echo of her presence lingered, a melody he couldn't unhear. Downstairs, the housekeeper, Mrs. Ellis, looked up as Clara descended, the red mark on her cheek glowing in the dim light. She said nothing, only nodded as Clara pulled on her coat and stepped into the rain. The gate creaked shut behind her, and the mansion fell silent, not with peace, but with the weight of something unfinished. Julian sat alone, the music sheet in his hand, its notes a whisper of something he'd lost, and something he might yet find. The storm had retreated, leaving behind a damp chill that seeped into the bones of Julian Vance's mansion. Dawn broke, gray and heavy, casting muted light through the tall windows of the foyer. The house, once a fortress of order, now felt like a mausoleum, its silence louder than the thunder that had raged the night before. Julian stood at the top of the staircase, his hands still tingling from the slap he'd delivered to Clara Reed. The memory of her eyes, green, unyielding, brimming with a sadness that cut deeper than his anger, clung to him like damp wool. He'd driven her out, the one person who'd brought a flicker of peace to his daughters, Melody and Harmony. Downstairs, the twins sat at the breakfast table, their blonde curls catching the light like halos. 6 years old, they were mirror images of their mother, Elise, whose laughter once filled these halls. But since her death, their voices had vanished, locked behind the wall of selective mutism that no therapist could breach. Julian watched them now, their small hands clutching spoons, their eyes fixed on their untouched oatmeal. They didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge the plate of toast he set before them. The silence was a blade, slicing through his carefully constructed world. "Girl," he said, his voice softer than he meant, "you need to eat." Melody's spoon stilled, but her gaze remained on the table. Harmony's fingers tightened around her glass of milk, her knuckles pale. Julian's chest ached. He'd built skyscrapers that touched the clouds, yet he couldn't reach his own children. He turned away, the weight of their rejection pressing against his ribs. In his study, Julian sank into his leather chair, the room a shrine to his need for control. Blueprints pinned neatly to the walls, books aligned with military precision. But the order mocked him now. On the desk lay the sheet of music Clara had left behind, Leo's Lullaby, its handwritten notes curling like a question he couldn't answer. He traced the title, the ink smudged as if touched by hurried hands. Who was Leo? Why had Clara, a stranger, unlocked something in his daughters that he couldn't? The questions gnawed at him, each one a crack in the facade he'd built since Elise's car spun out on that rain-slicked road. The phone rang, jarring him. Marcus Thorne's name flashed on the screen, and Julian's jaw tightened. His late wife's brother, a man whose charm was as polished as his cruelty was subtle. "Julian," Marcus's voice purred, smooth as velvet over steel. "I heard about last night. Firing another nanny? I'm worried about the girls." The concern was a lie, thinly veiled, and Julian knew it. Marcus had always blamed him for Elise's death, claiming his rigidity had crushed her spirit. "You sure you've got everything under control?" Marcus continued, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "Those girls need stability, not chaos." Julian gripped the phone, his knuckles white. They're fine, Ishran-san, he lied, the words bitter on his tongue. Marcus chuckled, a sound that made Julian's skin crawl. If you say so, I'm just looking out for my nieces. The call ended, but Marcus's words lingered, sowing seeds of doubt that took root in Julian's already fractured mind. He wandered to the twins' playroom, hoping for a sign of connection. The room was pristine, toys untouched since Elise's death. In the corner stood a canvas, one of her chaotic paintings, swirls of blue and gold that Julian had once despised for their lack of structure. He stared at it now, his fingers hovering over the brushstrokes. He'd loved her freedom once, hadn't he? Before it became the chaos he blamed for her death. The urge to tear the canvas down surged, but he stopped, his hand trembling. Destroying it wouldn't bring her back, or his daughter's voices. Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper, entered quietly, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun. They won't come out of their room, sir, she said, her voice gentle but firm. They've been sitting on the floor, holding each other since breakfast. Julian nodded, his throat tight. Did they say anything? He asked, already knowing the answer. Mrs. Ellis shook her head. Not a word, but they were calmer with Miss Reed. I saw it. Her words stung, a reminder of his failure. Julian returned to his study, the music sheet still on his desk. He unfolded it, the notes blurring as his eyes burned. Clara had stayed with his daughters through a storm, offering them safety he couldn't provide, and he'd struck her for it. The shame was a weight, heavy and unyielding, pulling him toward a truth he wasn't ready to face. His control was a cage, not a shield. He stood, slipping the sheet into his pocket. The twins needed more than his rules, more than his sterile order. Clara's melody, brief as it was, had reached them. He didn't know her story, didn't know why her hands trembled when she left. But he knew one thing. He had to find her. The silence in his home was no longer just an absence. It was a challenge, a call to break the walls he'd built. As he grabbed his coat, the faint hum of Leo's lullaby echoed in his mind, a fragile thread leading him into the unknown. The city streets were slick with the remnants of last night's storm, reflecting the gray sky and fractured pools. Julian Vance drove with a purpose he hadn't felt in years, the folded sheet of Leo's lullaby burning a hole in his coat pocket. The silence of his mansion, once a comfort, now screamed of his failure. A father who couldn't reach his daughters, a man who'd struck the one person who had. Melody and harmony, their small faces blank at breakfast, haunted him. Their mutism, a wall he'd built with his own rigidity, had only crumbled in Clara Reed's presence. He had to find her. The address Mrs. Ellis had given him led to a crumbling community center on the city's edge, its brick facade weathered, windows patched with tape. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and wax, and a faint hum of voices drifted from a back room. Julian hesitated at the threshold, his polished shoes out of place on the scuffed linoleum. Through a cracked door, he saw her, Clara, seated at a battered upright piano, her fingers coaxing a gentle melody from keys yellowed by time. A boy, no older than 8, sat beside her, his shoulders hunched, eyes red from crying. Clara's voice, soft as a summer breeze, wove through the notes. It's okay to feel it, she said. Let the music carry it. The boy's trembling hands touched the keys, and a single note rang out, pure and unbroken. His tears slowed. Julian's breath caught. This was no ordinary caretaker. Clara's gift wasn't just music. It was a bridge to souls too wounded to speak. He stepped forward, the floor creaking under his weight, and Clara's head snapped up. Her green eyes, still shadowed by the memory of his slap, met his. The boy flinched, but Clara rested a hand on his shoulder, whispering something that calmed him. She rose, closing the piano lid with a quiet thud. Mr. Vance, she said, her voice steady but guarded. What are you doing here? He swallowed, the words he'd rehearsed dissolving under her gaze. I was wrong, he said, the admission raw. I shouldn't have raised my hand. I shouldn't have sent you away. Clara's expression didn't soften, but she tilted her head, listening. Melody and harmony, they haven't slept like that since their mother died. You gave them something I can't. He pulled the music sheet from his pocket, its edges crinkled. I don't know who Leo is, but I know you reached them. Please, come back. Clara's fingers brushed the sheet, her eyes flickering with something, pain perhaps, or memory. I stay because they needed me, she said, not because of you. If I come back, it's on my terms. Julian nodded, desperate. Name them. She stepped closer, her voice firm. You join us for music sessions, no standing on the sidelines. You let me create a space, a creative room, where they can paint, play, make a mess without you flinching. And you learn to live with a little chaos. They need it to heal. Julian's jaw tightened. Chaos was his enemy, the force he blamed for Elise's death. But the image of his daughters, curled against Clara, overrode his resistance. Agreed, he said, the word heavy. Clara studied him, then nodded. Tomorrow, then. The next morning, the Vance mansion felt different, as if Clara's return had shifted its pulse. She arrived at dawn, her canvas bag slung over her shoulder, her face resolute. Melody and Harmony, perched on the staircase, watched her enter, their eyes bright with something like hope. Julian led her to a spare room, its walls bare, its potential daunting. This is yours, he said, for your creative room. Clara set to work, arranging easels, paints, and a small keyboard, her movements deliberate. Julian hovered, unease prickling, as paint cans cluttered his pristine space. Clara didn't push the twins to speak. Instead, she sat at the keyboard, her fingers tracing the notes of Leo's lullaby. The melody was simple, almost childlike, yet it filled the room with a warmth that made Julian's chest ache. Melody and Harmony drifted closer, their small feet silent on the hardwood. Clara smiled, not at them, but at the music, inviting them in. She tapped a rhythm on a drum, offering them sticks. Harmony hesitated, then struck a beat, her face intent. Melody watched, her fingers twitching. Then, in a moment that stopped time, Melody stepped to the keyboard and pressed a single key. The note rang out, clear and fragile, like a crack in ice. Julian, standing in the doorway, froze. It was the first deliberate act his daughter had made in months, a spark of life in her silent world. Clara didn't react, only continued playing, but her eyes shone with quiet triumph. Julian's throat tightened, his need for control warring with the hope blooming in his chest. As the session ended, Clara handed the twins paintbrushes and they smeared colors on a canvas. Chaotic, vibrant swirls that echoed Elise's art. Julian flinched but stayed silent, his fingers curling into fists. The room was a mess, but his daughters weren't. For the first time, he saw them not as broken, but as reaching. Outside, the phone rang. Marcus's voice would soon slither through, planting seeds of doubt. But for now, Julian stood in the doorway, the echo of Melody's note lingering, a fragile promise of something new. The creative room pulsed with life, a stark contrast to the sterile order of the Vance mansion. Canvases leaned against walls, streaked with vibrant blues and golds, while a small keyboard hummed with the faint echo of Leo's lullaby. Clara Reed moved with quiet purpose, arranging paintbrushes and rhythm sticks, her presence a steady anchor in the chaos she'd insisted upon. Julian Vance lingered in the doorway, his jaw tight as he surveyed the mess. Paint splattered on the floor, a drum tipped precariously on its side. This room, once a blank slate, now challenged every instinct he'd honed as an architect of precision. Yet the memory of Melody's single note, struck with hesitant courage, kept him rooted, unable to turn away. Clara knelt beside Melody and Harmony, their blonde curls catching the morning light filtering through the tall windows. The twins, silent as ever, watched her with wide eyes, their hands clasped together as if to anchor themselves. Since Clara's return, they'd gravitated toward her, drawn by the music that seemed to speak where words failed. "Let's try something new today," Clara said, her voice soft but inviting, like a melody in itself. She tapped a rhythm on the drum, slow and steady, then handed each girl a stick. Harmony hesitated, her fingers brushing the wood before tapping a faint beat. Her brow furrowed in concentration. Melody watched, her eyes flickering between her sister and Clara, as if weighing whether to join. Julian shifted, his polished shoes scuffing the hardwood. He'd promised to participate, but every fiber of his being resisted this disorder. His late wife Elise had thrived in chaos, her piano compositions spilling over like wildflowers, untamed and reckless. He loved her for it once, until that recklessness stole her from him in a rain-slicked crash. Now watching Clara coax his daughters into this messy world of paint and sound, he felt the old fear rising, a fear that chaos would unravel them all again. Clara switched to the keyboard, her fingers tracing the familiar notes of Leo's lullaby. The melody wove through the room, simple yet haunting, its cadence a gentle call. Harmony set down her stick, her small hands reaching for a paintbrush. She dipped it in crimson, smearing a bold arc across a canvas, her movements mirroring the music's rhythm. Julian's breath caught. It was the first time he'd seen his daughter create, not just exist. Melody, still silent, picked up a brush and added a swirl of green, the colors blending in a chaotic dance that reminded him painfully of Elise's art. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to straighten the canvas. Clara glanced at him, her green eyes sharp but kind. "Join us," she said, not a command but a challenge. Julian hesitated, then sat awkwardly beside the twins, picking up a brush. His strokes were rigid, a stark line of black that clashed with the girls' vibrant swirls. Harmony glanced at him, her expression unreadable, but she didn't pull away. It was progress, fragile and fleeting, but progress nonetheless. The moment was shattered with the chime of the doorbell. Mrs. Ellis ushered in Marcus Thorne, his tailored suit and slick smile as out of place in the creative room as a hawk in a dovecote. His eyes, sharp as cut glass, swept over the paint-splattered floor and the twins' budding artwork. "Julian," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "What's this? Letting a stranger turn your home into a circus?" He knelt beside Melody, brushing a curl from her face, but she shrank back, clutching Clara's sleeve. Marcus's smile tightened, a flicker of irritation betraying his charm. "My sister would have hated this," he said, his gaze locking on Julian. "She'd want her girls nurtured, not unleashed." Julian's stomach churned. Marcus's words, laced with accusation, echoed his own fears, that he was failing Elise, failing his daughters. "It's under control," he said, the lie bitter on his tongue. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his smile a blade. "Is it? I'm just looking out for my nieces, Julian. Someone has to." He stood, brushing imaginary dust from his suit. "I'll be in touch." As Marcus left, the air grew heavy, his words lingering like a storm cloud. Clara resumed playing, but her notes were softer now, as if shielding the twins from the tension. Julian watched her, the way her hands moved with purpose, coaxing life from silence. He wanted to believe in her, in this chaotic room, but Marcus's presence had stirred the doubt he'd tried to bury. That evening, as Clara packed up, Harmony lingered, her small hand tracing the keyboard's edge. She pressed a key, a single note ringing out, tentative but clear. Clara smiled and Julian's heart stuttered. It was another crack in the wall of silence, another step towards something he couldn't yet name. But as he locked the front door, the phone in his study blinked with a new message. Marcus's voice, smooth and venomous, waited to unravel the fragile hope Clara had kindled. The creative room, with its messy promise, stood in defiance of the storm brewing beyond these walls. The Vance mansion, once a bastion of order, now hummed with an uneasy pulse. The creative room, with its vibrant chaos of paint and music, stood as a fragile beacon of hope, but shadows crept at its edges. Julian Vance paced the study, the echo of Marcus Thorne's venomous parting words. "I'll be in touch," clinging to him like damp fog. Clara Reed's return had sparked something in his silent daughters, Melody and Harmony, their tentative notes and painted swirls a crack in their wall of mutism. Yet Marcus's visit, his slick smile and barbed remarks, had planted a seed of doubt that Julian couldn't uproot. His need for control, already fraying, now teetered on the edge of collapse. Clara, in the creative room, guided the twins through a morning session. Her fingers danced over the keyboard, coaxing Leo's lullaby into the air, its gentle notes a lifeline for the girls. Harmony, bolder now, tapped a rhythm on a drum, her small face alight with focus. Melody, more reserved, added soft strokes of blue to a canvas, her movements mirroring the melody's flow. Julian watched from the doorway, his heart caught between awe and unease. The room's disorder, paint cans strewn about, brushes scattered, grated against his instincts, but the twins' engagement held him captive. Clara caught his eye, her gaze steady. "You're staring," she said, a hint of a smile softening her words. Julian shifted, forcing a nod. "It's different." The fragile peace was shattered that afternoon. A letter arrived, slipped under the front door, its typed words stark. "Your staff have concerns about your stability, Mr. Vance. Resign your duties for the girl's sake." No signature, no return address, but the accusation burned. Julian summoned Mrs. Ellis, his voice sharp. "Who's been talking?" The housekeeper's eyes widened, her hands twisting in her apron. "No one, sir. We're loyal." But her hesitation, the flicker of doubt, fueled his paranoia. He stormed through the house, checking locks, his mind spiraling. Had Clara's presence invited this scrutiny? Was his control slipping further? Clara, sensing the shift, found him in his study, the letter crumpled on his desk. "This isn't about the staff," she said, her voice low but firm. "It's Marcus." Julian's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know him." Clara stepped closer, undeterred. "I know enough. The cameras. There's a glitch in the footage every time he visits. Last week, the system went down for an hour after he left. And now this letter? He's trying to make you doubt yourself, Julian." Her words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through his defenses. "Why would he?" Julian demanded, but his voice wavered, betraying the fear that Marcus's accusations held a kernel of truth. That evening, Clara sat alone in the guest room, reviewing security logs on a borrowed laptop. Her fingers trembled as she traced the timestamps, each outage aligned with Marcus's presence. She recalled his visit, the way his smile never reached his eyes, the way he'd lingered near the twins' playroom. Then a memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. Marcus's voice, low and cutting, as he'd cornered her in the hallway yesterday. "I know about Leo," he'd said, his tone laced with menace. "A teacher who let her student die. What makes you think you're fit for my nieces?" The accusation had struck deep, unearthing her guilt over Leo's death, a boy whose voice she'd unlocked through music, only to lose him to a tragic accident. She'd stood firm, but the threat lingered, a warning that Marcus was digging into her past. Clara shared her findings with Julian, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "He's gaslighting you, Julian, making you question your sanity, your fitness as a father. We need to check the cameras again." Julian's face darkened, his hands clenching. "You're saying my wife's brother is sabotaging me?" His voice rose, a mix of disbelief and fury. "He's family." Clara held his gaze, unflinching. "Family can hurt the deepest. I've seen it before." Her words, heavy with unspoken pain, silenced him. He nodded, reluctant but desperate, agreeing to review the footage. As Clara left the study, she paused at the creative room where Melody and Harmony sat, their small hands smearing paint in quiet harmony. Harmony looked up, her eyes searching, and Clara knelt beside her, offering a gentle smile. "You're doing beautifully," she whispered, her heart heavy with the weight of Marcus's threat. She couldn't let him unravel this fragile progress. Julian, watching from the hall, felt a pang of gratitude and fear. Clara was right, but the truth was a blade, cutting too close to his own doubts. That night, a message waited on Julian's phone, Marcus's voice smooth and cold. "I've filed for custody, Julian, for the girl's sake." The words were a gauntlet, thrown down in the dark, promising a storm that would test the fragile hope Clara had kindled in his home. The Vance mansion thrummed with a tension as taut as piano wire. Marcus Thorne's voicemail. "I've filed for custody, Julian, for the girl's sake," echoed in Julian Vance's mind, a venomous promise that threatened to unravel the fragile progress in his home. Clara Reed's revelation about the tampered security footage and Marcus's chilling reference to her past had ignited a fire in Julian, one that burned through his doubt. His brother-in-law, the polished art critic with a serpent's smile, was no longer just a thorn. He was a predator, circling his daughters, Melody and Harmony. Clara's words, "family can hurt the deepest," lingered, urging Julian to act before the silence of his twins became permanent. In the creative room, Clara knelt beside Melody, guiding her small hand to paint a golden sun, while Harmony tapped a soft rhythm on a drum. The twins' tentative engagement, sparked by Clara's music, was a lifeline Julian couldn't afford to lose. But Marcus's accusations that Julian was unstable, that Clara was unfit, gnawed at him. Clara caught his gaze from across the room, her green eyes resolute. "We need a plan," she said, her voice low to shield the girls. "Marcus is counting on you breaking. We'll use that against him." Julian's jaw tightened, his architect's mind craving order. But he nodded. "What do you propose?" Clara's plan was bold: stage a fracture in their fragile alliance to lure Marcus into overconfidence. "I'll pretend to leave," she said. "After a fight, he'll think you're unraveling, make a mistake." Julian hesitated, the memory of his slap in that storm-soaked night still raw. "And if he doesn't take the bait?" Clara's gaze hardened. "He will. He's already digging into my past, Leo's death. He thinks he can break me too." Her voice cracked, betraying the wound Marcus had reopened, but she straightened. "We'll need a camera, hidden, somewhere he'd act." That night, Julian installed a discreet camera in the music room, where Elise's cherished grand piano stood, its polished surface a silent monument to her chaos. Clara's suggestion was precise. Marcus, obsessed with his sister's legacy, might target the piano to destabilize Julian further. The plan felt like a gamble, but Clara's certainty anchored him. At dawn, they staged their argument in the foyer, loud enough for Mrs. Ellis to overhear. "You're ruining them!" Julian shouted, his voice strained with feigned fury. Clara's eyes glistened, her performance flawless. "I'm done, Julian. I can't stay where I'm not trusted." She grabbed her coat, slamming the door as she left, her silhouette vanishing into the morning mist. Marcus arrived hours later, his suit pristine, his smile a mask of concern. "Trouble in paradise?" he asked, eyeing the creative room's chaos with disdain. Julian played his part, shoulders slumped, voice hollow. "She's gone. You were right. She was too much." Marcus's eyes gleamed, a predator sensing blood. "You'll get through this, Julian. For the girls." He lingered in the music room, his fingers trailing over the piano, a smirk flickering. That night, alone, he returned. The hidden camera caught every move. Marcus loosening a piano string, its discordant twang a deliberate wound. He slipped a forged note under the keys, accusing Julian of neglect, designed to look like a staff member's betrayal. Clara, watching the footage from a nearby cafe, clenched her coffee cup. "We've got him," she whispered, her voice steady despite the memory of Marcus's threat about Leo, a boy whose death she still carried like a stone. She returned to the mansion, her resolve unshaken. Julian, staring at the footage, felt rage and relief collide. "He's done," he said, his voice low. "But he's claiming you're unfit, too. Something about a lawsuit after Leo died." Clara's face paled, but she nodded. "It was dropped. I was cleared. But he'll use it to twist the truth." The courtroom was a sterile battlefield, its oak-paneled walls absorbing sound like a tomb. Marcus sat across from Julian, his face a mask of sincerity as he presented his case. Julian's instability, Clara's questionable past. "My nieces deserve better," he said, his voice smooth as silk. Julian's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Carter, countered with therapy records, showing the twins' progress since Clara's arrival. But Marcus's trump card landed, a fabricated document alleging Clara's negligence in Leo's death. Clara's hands trembled, but she stood, her voice clear. "Leo was my student," she said, facing the judge. "He died in an accident I couldn't prevent. I've carried that guilt, but I've never stopped trying to help children heal." Her words, raw and honest, silenced the room. Ms. Carter played the footage. The screen showed Marcus sabotaging the piano, planting the note, his smirk undeniable. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Marcus's facade crumbled, his eyes darting as the judge's gavel fell, dismissing his petition. Julian exhaled, his hand finding Clara's under the table. The victory was theirs, but the cost lingered in her haunted gaze. As they left the courthouse, the twins' silent hope waited at home, a fragile melody ready to grow louder. The Vance mansion exhaled, its walls no longer holding their breath. Marcus Thorne's defeat in the courtroom had lifted a shadow, but the air still carried the weight of truths unspoken. Julian Vance stood in the foyer, the echo of the judge's gavel mingling with the memory of Clara Reed's steady voice as she bared her past to protect his daughters, Melody and Harmony. The twins, unaware of the legal storm they'd weathered, played quietly in the creative room, their soft taps on a drum a fragile testament to Clara's influence. Julian's hand still tingled from where it had clasped hers under the courtroom table, a silent vow to rebuild what grief had torn apart. Clara moved through the creative room with a quiet grace, arranging paintbrushes beside a canvas streaked with the twins' vibrant swirls. The space, once a battleground for Julian's need for order, now felt like a sanctuary. Melody and Harmony sat cross-legged on the floor, their blonde curls catching the afternoon light. Clara handed them a small box of old piano strings, their ends tied into delicate loops. "For you," she said, her voice soft. "Make something beautiful." Harmony's eyes widened, and she wove the strings into a bracelet, her fingers trembling with purpose. Melody, more cautious, threaded hers with care, creating a matching band. They presented the gifts to Clara, their silent offering a bridge across their muted world. Clara's throat tightened as she slipped the bracelets on, their weight a reminder of the trust she'd earned. Julian watched from the doorway, his chest aching. The twins' gesture was a milestone, a sign of life where silence had reigned. He'd failed them for so long, hiding behind blueprints and control, but Clara had cracked open their world with music and patience. He stepped inside, his polished shoes scuffing the paint-splattered floor. "They're for you," he said, nodding at the bracelets. Clara's green eyes met his, shimmering with unshed tears. "They're more than I deserve," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft hum of the keyboard. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden streaks through the creative room, Clara sat at the keyboard. Her fingers traced the familiar notes of Leo's lullaby, the melody a tender thread weaving through the silence. Melody and Harmony climbed onto the bench beside her, their small hands resting on the keys. The music swelled, simple yet profound, and then, like a miracle, Harmony whispered, "Beautiful." The words, soft as a breath, hung in the air. Julian froze, his heart stuttering. Melody, her eyes wide, turned to Clara. "Who's Leo?" she asked, her voice a delicate chime, the first she'd spoken in years. Clara's hands stilled, the notes fading into silence. She looked at the twins, their faces open and trusting, and then at Julian, whose eyes held a quiet plea. She drew a shaky breath, her past rising like a tide. "Leo was my student," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "He was like you, quiet, locked in his own world. I taught him piano, and he started to speak through the music. But he died in an accident, right after his first performance. I blamed myself, thought I hadn't protected him." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "I carried that guilt until you two showed me I could try again." Melody reached for Clara's hand, her small fingers warm against her skin. Harmony leaned against her, a silent embrace. Julian crossed the room, his own eyes glistening. He knelt beside them, his voice breaking. "I've been so afraid of losing you," he said to his daughters, "that I lost myself. I'm sorry." He pulled them close, their small bodies fitting against his, and Clara joined, her hand resting on his shoulder. The room, filled with the ghosts of their grief, pulsed with a new rhythm, connection, raw and unguarded. As the twins drifted to sleep that night, their bracelets glinting in the lamplight, Julian and Clara stood in the hallway, the weight of their shared moment lingering. "You gave them their voices," Julian said, his voice low. Clara shook her head. "They gave me mine." She paused, then added, "I've been thinking about Elise's studio, the one you've kept locked. What if we opened it, not just for them, but for others? A place for music, for healing." Julian's breath caught. Elise's studio, a shrine to her chaotic brilliance, had been untouchable. But now the idea felt like a key turning in a long rusted lock. He nodded, his hand brushing Clara's. "Let's do it," he said, the words a promise to his daughters, to Clara, to himself. The creative room, with its messy canvases and scattered notes, had become a beginning, not an end. As they stood together, the faint echo of Leo's lullaby seemed to linger, a melody carrying them toward a future where silence could sing. The Vance mansion, once a fortress of cold precision, now hummed with life, its walls no longer guarding silence but embracing sound. The creative room, with its vibrant canvases and scattered instruments, had sparked a transformation, kindled by Clara Reed's music and sealed by the whispered words of melody and harmony. Julian Vance stood in the hallway, the memory of his daughter's voices. Beautiful, who's Leo? And Clara's tearful confession about her lost student still resonating. The courtroom victory over Marcus Thorne had cleared the storm, but it was the twins' fragile trust, woven through Clara's melodies, that rebuilt the foundation. Elise's locked studio, a shrine to her chaotic brilliance, waited to be reborn. Morning light streamed through the mansion's tall windows, casting golden patterns across the foyer. Clara knelt in the creative room, guiding melody and harmony as they painted a mural. A swirling sky of blues and yellows, dotted with stars. The twins, their blonde curls bouncing, chattered softly, their voices a miracle after years of silence. Harmony dipped her brush in crimson, giggling as paint flecked her cheek. Melody, more deliberate, added a crescent moon, her eyes bright with purpose. Julian watched, his architect's heart, once obsessed with straight lines, softening at the sight of their joyful chaos. The bracelets they'd crafted from old piano strings glinted on Clara's wrists, a testament to their bond. Clara stood, wiping paint from her hands, and caught Julian's gaze. "They're ready," she said, her voice steady but warm. "For the studio." Julian nodded, his throat tight. Elise's studio, untouched since her death, had been a wound he couldn't face, a room of wild colors and scattered sheet music that mocked his need for control. But Clara's vision, to transform it into a music and art space for the community, felt like a bridge between past and future. He led the way, the twins trailing behind, their small hands clutching paintbrushes like talismans. The studio door creaked open, releasing a faint scent of jasmine and dust. Sunlight spilled across a grand piano, its keys untouched since Elise's fingers last danced over them. Canvases leaned against walls, their abstract swirls echoing the twins' mural. Julian's chest ached, memories of Elise's laughter mingling with the pain of her loss. Clara stepped inside, her fingers brushing the piano, and played a single note, clear and resonant. Melody and Harmony gasped, their eyes wide. "Mommy's piano," Harmony whispered, her voice a delicate chime. Julian knelt beside them, his hand trembling. "It's yours now, too," he said, the words of release. Over the next weeks, the studio transformed. Clara and Julian worked side by side, sanding easels, hanging string lights, and arranging instruments. The twins helped, their laughter filling the space as they strung beads onto rhythm sticks. Mrs. Ellis, her usual reserve softened, brought lemonade and cookies, her eyes crinkling at the sight of the girls' joy. The music and art space opened on a crisp morning, its doors flung wide to children from the community. Boys and girls, some shy, some bold, poured in, their hands eager for paint and music. Clara guided a young girl to the piano, her fingers coaxing a hesitant melody, while Melody and Harmony showed a boy how to mix colors, their voices mingling in a duet of giggles. Julian stood at the edge, his tailored suit replaced by a soft sweater, his hands no longer clenched but open. He watched Clara, her green eyes alight as she taught, and felt a warmth he hadn't known since Elise. The studio, once a tomb, now pulsed with life, its chaos a symphony of healing. He joined the twins, picking up a brush and painting a clumsy star beside their mural. Harmony laughed, smearing blue on his sleeve, and Julian didn't flinch. For the first time, he felt like their father, not just their guardian. That evening, as the last visitors left, Clara sat at the piano, her fingers tracing Leo's lullaby. The twins climbed beside her, their small hands adding soft notes, a tentative harmony. Julian sat nearby, his eyes tracing the lines of their faces, so like Elise's, yet wholly their own. "This is what she'd want," he said, his voice low. Clara paused, her hands resting on the keys. "It's what they need," she replied, nodding at the twins. "And us." She began a new melody, its notes unfinished, a promise of creation yet to come. The mansion, once silent, now sang with laughter and music. The twins' voices, once locked away, wove through the air, their words a testament to Clara's patience. Julian, no longer bound by his need for order, saw the beauty in their messy stars. The music and art space stood as a legacy, not just to Elise, but to the family they'd built through shared pain and hope. As Clara's new melody lingered, a sketchbook lay open beside her, its pages blank but waiting, ready for the next chapter of their song. As the final notes of the sound of healing fade, we leave Julian, Clara, melody, and harmony in a home, alive with music and hope. Their journey reminds us that even the deepest silence can sing again. What did their story stir in you? Share your thoughts, your reflections, or where you're listening from. Perhaps a quiet corner or a bustling street. Your voice matters. Thank you for joining us, for letting this tale resonate in your heart. Until we meet again, keep seeking the melodies that heal. Stay tuned for more stories that mend and inspire.